The sun had barely touched the horizon when Ruth pushed open the door to her little diner on Route 47. The bell above the entrance gave its usual soft jingle, echoing in the empty room. She loved that sound. It meant another day was beginning. The smell of fresh coffee and baked bread soon filled the air as she moved around the kitchen with practiced ease. Every cup, every plate, every movement carried the rhythm of her life, steady, patient, and hardworking. Ruth had owned the diner for nearly 15 years. It wasn't much, just a small roadside stop with 6 booths, a jukebox that only worked when it wanted to, and a hand-painted sign that read, Mabel's Roadhouse Diner. It had been her mother's dream long ago, and when her mother passed, Ruth promised to keep it alive. The locals came in for the food, but they stayed for Ruth's easy laughter and the way she remembered everyone's favorite order. The usual? She'd ask before they even sat down, and that simple kindness was enough to make people feel at home. But lately, things had been slow. The new highway built a few miles east had pulled most of the traffic away. Now, instead of truckers and travelers filling the booths, Ruth served mostly regulars, a few farmers, a retired teacher, and the mail carrier. She tried not to let the worry show, but some nights she stayed late doing math on napkins, trying to figure out how to pay next month's bills. The old neon sign outside flickered so badly it sometimes spelled Abel's Din, and she couldn't afford to fix it. Still, she kept smiling, believing that good things found their way back around. That Thursday morning was cold and gray, the kind of morning where rain looked like it might hang around all day. Ruth flipped the sign to open and poured herself a cup of coffee. She liked the quiet before the day started. There was something comforting about the stillness, the sound of the coffee pot gurgling, the hum of the refrigerator, the faint whisper of wind outside. Then she heard it, a low growl of an engine coming down the road. It wasn't a truck or a car. It was a motorcycle. A moment later, the door creaked open. A man stepped in, tall and broad, with a long leather jacket soaked from the rain. His hair was hidden under a black helmet, and when he removed it, Ruth noticed the roughness in his face, the kind that told of long roads and hard days. He looked around, cautious but polite. The patch on the back of his jacket caught her eye. 2 red wings and the words Hell's Angels. Ruth had seen bikers before, but never this close. They usually passed through in groups, their engines loud, their presence strong. But this man was alone, and something about that felt strange. He nodded once and sat near the window. "Morning," he said quietly. "Morning," Ruth replied, keeping her tone calm. "Coffee?" He nodded. "Black, please." As she poured the cup, she couldn't help but study him a little. His hands were rough and covered in small scars, his knuckles slightly bruised. But his eyes, they weren't what she expected. They were tired, yes, but also gentle. He thanked her softly when she placed the coffee in front of him, and she caught a hint of something in his voice, maybe pain or maybe regret. She couldn't tell. Minutes passed in silence. The only sound was the rain tapping against the glass and the soft clink of his spoon against the cup. Ruth went about wiping the counter, pretending not to watch him. She had learned long ago that everyone who came through her doors carried a story. Some just weren't ready to tell it yet. Then the peace shattered. 2 police cruisers pulled up outside, red and blue lights flashing against the gray sky. Ruth frowned. It wasn't common for police to show up here. The man at the window stiffened. His hand froze halfway to his coffee cup. The diner door swung open and 2 officers walked in, their boots heavy on the tile. One was tall and serious, the other younger and restless. The older one tipped his hat politely. "Morning, ma'am," he said. "Sorry to bother you, but we're looking for someone." Ruth nodded slowly. "What kind of someone?" "A biker," the younger officer answered. "Riding a black Harley. Might have come through this way about 10 minutes ago." She glanced at the man by the window. He was staring down at his cup, trying not to move. A bead of water slid from his hair onto his jacket. In that moment, Ruth's heart thumped in her chest. She didn't know who he was or what he'd done, but something in his face didn't look dangerous, it looked scared. "A biker, huh?" she said slowly, turning back to the officers. "Can't say I've seen anyone like that this morning." The younger officer looked around suspiciously. "You sure?" "Big guy, beard, black jacket. Hard to miss." Ruth smiled faintly. "Honey, I've been up since 5:30. Only thing I seen so far is my coffee pot." The older officer gave a small chuckle, but the younger one didn't look convinced. He took a step toward the back. "Mind if we check the restroom?" Of course, Ruth said. But before he could move, she accidentally knocked over a tray of dishes. They clattered to the floor with a loud crash, sending coffee cups rolling in every direction. "Oh Lord," she said, crouching down quickly to gather them. "These hands of mine get clumsier every year." The noise startled everyone, and for a few seconds, chaos filled the diner. The younger officer sighed in frustration while helping her pick up the plates. By the time they looked up again, the sound of a door creaking at the back went unnoticed. The man in the leather jacket had slipped out the rear exit quietly. After a few minutes, the officers gave up their search. "If you see him, give us a call," the older one said, handing her a card. "He might be in some trouble," Ruth nodded. "I'll let you know if I do." They thanked her and left, the sound of their engines fading into the distance. The diner fell silent again. Ruth stood behind the counter, her hands still trembling a little. She took a deep breath, then walked toward the back door. When she opened it, she found the man standing behind the dumpster, soaked to the bone but alive. He looked up at her, his eyes filled with disbelief. "You didn't tell them," he said quietly. Ruth crossed her arms. "Didn't seem like they needed to know." He hesitated, then stepped closer. "Why would you do that for me? You don't even know me." She looked at him for a long moment. "You looked like a man who's already been through enough trouble. I didn't see a reason to add more." He nodded slowly, his voice thick. "You just saved my life, ma'am." Before she could say anything, he pulled a small silver pin from his jacket pocket and placed it on the counter near the door. It was the same winged emblem she'd seen on his back, only smaller, almost like a token. Then he disappeared into the rain, his motorcycle roaring to life in the distance. Ruth stood there for a long while, staring at the little silver pin. She didn't know what kind of man he was or what the police wanted him for. All she knew was that something deep inside her told her she had done the right thing. Maybe it was foolish, maybe it was brave, but it felt right. That night, when she locked up the diner, the rain had stopped. The moon peeked through the clouds, casting a pale glow across the parking lot. Ruth slipped the small pin into her apron pocket and whispered softly to herself, "Sometimes you just have to trust what your heart tells you." She had no idea that this single act of kindness would bring 200 roaring motorcycles to her doorstep the very next day. The next morning came slow and heavy, with clouds hanging low over the hills. Ruth woke up earlier than usual, her mind still replaying what had happened the day before. She kept seeing that man's face in her head, the soaked jacket, the tired eyes, and the quiet way he'd said thank you. She told herself it was over, that she'd never see him again. But deep down, she couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that maybe she had stepped into something bigger than she understood. At the diner, everything looked the same, but it didn't feel the same. The bell above the door still jingled when she opened it, but the air felt heavier. She moved through her morning routine slowly, glancing now and then at the little silver pin she had left on the counter. It shimmered in the morning light, like it didn't belong in a place so ordinary. She thought about throwing it away but couldn't bring herself to do it. Instead, she tucked it back into her apron pocket and whispered to herself, "It's just another day, Ruth. Just another day." By 7 o'clock, a few regulars came in. Old Mr. Turner from the farm down the road took his usual seat by the window, and young Lucy, the mail carrier, ordered her usual slice of pie to go. They talked about the weather, the muddy fields, and the rumor that a bear had been spotted near the woods. No one mentioned the police cars from yesterday. Maybe they didn't know. Maybe they didn't care. Around mid-morning, Ruth stepped outside to dump the trash. The air was damp, and the road was quiet except for the distant hum of a passing truck. She took a deep breath and tried to calm the uneasiness in her chest. That's when she noticed it. Tire marks near the back of the diner, fresh and deep. She crouched down, touched the wet ground, and felt her heart skip. They were from a motorcycle. Before she could think too much about it, the sound of an engine echoed faintly in the distance. She froze, listening. But it wasn't just one engine, it was several. The low, steady rumble grew louder, closer, until it rolled through the valley like thunder. Ruth straightened, her eyes wide. A line of motorcycles appeared on the hill, their headlights glowing through the mist. One after another, they came down the road, a long line of riders dressed in leather and denim, their jackets marked with the same red-winged emblem. Her stomach twisted. She didn't know what they wanted, but she had a strong feeling it had something to do with yesterday. She stepped back inside and stood behind the counter, pretending to wipe a glass. The bell above the door rang, and the first biker stepped in. Then another, and another. Within minutes, half the diner was filled with the sound of boots, jackets creaking, and the faint smell of gasoline and rain. The regulars froze mid-bite, staring at the unexpected crowd. One of the bikers, a tall woman with short silver hair, approached the counter. Her voice was calm but firm. "You the owner?" Ruth nodded slowly. "That's me." The woman smiled faintly. "Then we're in the right place." She turned toward the door and gave a small signal. More riders began to file in, filling every booth, every stool, even standing along the walls. Ruth's hands trembled slightly as she poured coffee after coffee, trying to act normal. Finally, the silver-haired woman leaned closer. "He told us what you did," she said quietly. "The one you helped yesterday. You didn't have to, but you did." Not many people would have done that. Ruth blinked, caught off guard. "He told you?" The woman nodded. "He made it home safe because of you. Said you were kind even when you didn't know him. That kind of thing means something to us." Ruth wasn't sure what to say. "I just did what felt right," she said softly. "Didn't seem fair to turn someone over when I didn't know the whole story." The woman smiled again. "Fair or not, you showed respect. That's rare these days." She glanced around the diner, then back at Ruth. "We're not here to cause trouble. We just wanted to show our thanks." Before Ruth could respond, one of the bikers near the door called out, "Hey boss, you gotta see this place. Feels like a piece of old America in here." Another one laughed and said, "Smells better than any diner I've been in too." The tension began to ease a little. Ruth exhaled slowly, realizing maybe they weren't here for bad reasons after all. Still, the sight of dozens of bikers in her tiny diner was something she would never forget. Their laughter filled the air, their boots tapping against the floor, the clink of forks and plates as they started ordering food like they hadn't eaten in days. Pancakes, eggs, coffee, everything she had was soon on the grill. Ruth moved, fast flipping, frying and serving, her worry melting into motion. "Need any help, ma'am?" one of them asked kindly. He was younger, his beard still patchy, his voice sincere. Ruth smiled despite herself. "If you know how to pour coffee without spilling it, I might just hire you." He grinned and grabbed the pot, moving from table to table, refilling cups. It felt strange, but in a good way, like the diner had suddenly come back to life. Hours passed. The bikers stayed polite, tipping well, joking quietly among themselves. Every so often, one or two of them would thank Ruth again, saying things like, "You did good," or, "That was brave of you." She didn't think of herself as brave, just human, but hearing those words warmed her heart. Around lunchtime, the silver-haired woman returned to the counter holding an envelope. She placed it gently in front of Ruth. "For you," she said. Ruth frowned. "What's this?" "Just a little thank you, from all of us." Ruth hesitated. "I can't take money from strangers." The woman smiled kindly. "We're not strangers anymore." Then she turned to leave, but before she reached the door, she looked back. "He told us your sign outside doesn't work. You should check again." When the last of the bikers left, the diner fell quiet again. Ruth walked to the window and watched as they rode away, their engines blending into one long roar before fading down the road. The parking lot was empty, except for a few damp boot prints and the faint smell of exhaust. She looked down at the envelope. Her hands shook as she opened it. Inside was a thick stack of cash, enough to pay off her bills, fix the sign, and still have some left over. She covered her mouth with her hand, tears welling in her eyes. It wasn't just the money. It was the kindness, the way strangers had shown up, not with anger or noise, but with gratitude. Ruth stepped outside and looked up at the old sign. The sun broke through the clouds just then, and she saw it flicker to life. The letters glowed bright red again. Mabel's Roadhouse Diner. She laughed softly, wiping her eyes. That evening, as she closed up, She found something else waiting for her on the counter. It was another small silver pin, just like the first one, but this time it had a note attached. The handwriting was rough but careful. For the woman who did right when no one else would. You've got friends on the road now. Ruth smiled and held the pin close to her chest. She didn't know where life would take her next, but she knew one thing for sure. Kindness had a way of coming back around, sometimes louder and brighter than she ever expected. The diner felt different that night. The air was lighter. The walls seemed warmer. And for the first time in a long while, Ruth didn't feel alone. Somewhere out there, the rumble of engines carried her name in gratitude. And that sound, she thought, was the sweetest music she had ever heard. The next few days passed quietly, but Ruth could still feel the echo of that strange morning when 200 bikers filled her diner. The sound of their engines had faded, but the memory stayed alive inside her. Every time she walked past the window, she half expected to see one of them ride up again. But the road stayed empty, the only noise coming from the wind and the occasional passing truck. The envelope they left behind sat safely in her drawer. She hadn't spent a single dollar from it yet. Every time she looked at it, she felt two things: gratitude and disbelief. It wasn't just about the money. It was about what it meant. In a world that often turned cold and distant, strangers had shown her kindness in a way she never could have imagined. But word travels fast in a small town, and by the end of the week, people had started talking. Some folks came in with smiles and curiosity, asking if it was true that a group of bikers had helped her out. Others looked uneasy, whispering to each other when they thought she couldn't hear. Not everyone liked the idea of Hell's Angels showing up in their quiet little town. Ruth stayed calm through it all. She knew rumors had a way of twisting stories. All she did was pour coffee, serve pie, and smile the way she always had. But deep inside, she wondered if maybe she had invited trouble she didn't mean to. One afternoon, just as she was cleaning up the counter, a familiar sound came from outside, the low, steady growl of a motorcycle. Her heart jumped. She wiped her hands on her apron and looked out the window. A single bike pulled up, covered in dust from the long road. The rider took off his helmet and she recognized him instantly. It was the same man she had helped that rainy morning. He stepped inside, giving her a small smile. "Didn't mean to scare you," he said softly. "Just passing through." Ruth smiled back, though her hands trembled slightly. "You're not scaring me. You want coffee?" "Always," he said, settling into the same seat by the window. For a while they sat in silence, the only sound being the soft hum of the ceiling fan. Ruth poured his coffee and waited. She could tell he wanted to say something but wasn't sure how. Finally he spoke. "They told me what they did. I didn't expect them to show up like that." "They were kind," Ruth said. "Surprised me too," he nodded slowly. "We don't always get treated kindly. People hear the name, see the jacket, and think they know what kind of men we are. But sometimes, we just need a place to sit, drink a cup of coffee, and remember we're still human." Ruth looked at him carefully. "I didn't ask what happened that day," she said quietly. "Didn't feel like it was my place, but I did wonder." He looked down at his cup, then back up at her. "It's not much of a story, really. Got into something I shouldn't have, nothing big, just wrong place, wrong time. The police wanted answers and I didn't have them. I wasn't running from a crime, just from being blamed for one." Ruth nodded. "Everyone deserves a fair chance to explain." He smiled faintly. "That's what you gave me. A chance." He paused, then added, "And you didn't have to." Ruth shrugged lightly. Sometimes doing the right thing doesn't need a reason. For the first time he laughed, a deep, warm laugh that filled the room. "You sound like my grandmother," he said. "She used to say, if you've got a roof, a heart, and a stove, you can't go wrong." Ruth chuckled. "Sounds like a smart woman." He nodded. "She was." Then his voice softened. "She passed a few years back. I think she'd have liked you." That moment hung between them, quiet but full of meaning. Ruth poured him another cup without asking. It felt easy now, like two old friends talking about life and loss. After a while, he reached into his pocket and took out something wrapped in cloth. He set it gently on the counter. "For you," he said. "A small thank you." Ruth hesitated, unwrapping the cloth. Inside was a tiny hand-carved wooden bird. The details were simple but beautiful. The wings spread wide, the feathers carved with care. "It's lovely," she whispered. "I make them on the road," he said. "Helps me stay grounded." Ruth smiled softly. "You've got talent." He shrugged, a little embarrassed. It's nothing fancy. Just a reminder that sometimes even rough hands can make gentle things. Ruth looked at the bird again, feeling something warm inside her chest. I'll keep it where I can see it, she said. Right next to the coffee pot. Maybe it'll bring good luck. He smiled, but there was something in his eyes, something distant, almost sad. You already got your luck, ma'am. You just don't know it yet. Before she could ask what he meant, he stood up, left some cash on the counter, and walked out into the sunlight. She watched as he put on his helmet and started the bike. The engine roared to life, and just before he rode off, he raised a hand in a small wave. Then he was gone again, leaving only the smell of exhaust and the sound of the wind. That night, Ruth sat alone in the diner after closing. She placed the wooden bird on a small shelf beside the silver pins. The moonlight coming through the window made the little bird glow faintly. She smiled, feeling comforted somehow. There was a strange peace in knowing that her kindness had mattered to someone. The next morning, things felt brighter. More customers started coming in. Word about her diner had spread in the best way this time. People wanted to visit the place where something special had happened. Travelers stopped to see the diner that had once been filled with bikers, to meet the woman who'd stood up for a stranger. Ruth welcomed them all with her same warm smile and endless coffee. One afternoon, a man in a suit came in. He ordered pie and sat quietly for a while, looking around. When he finished eating, he came to the counter. You're the owner, right? He asked. Yes, sir, Ruth said politely. He handed her a card. I'm from a travel magazine. We've heard about this place, about what happened here. We'd like to write a story. Ruth blinked, surprised. A story, he nodded. A story about kindness, about small-town heart. People need to hear things like that these days. She thought for a moment, then smiled. All right, but only if you promise to tell it right. No drama, no fancy words. Just the truth, the man laughed. Fair enough. The article came out 2 weeks later. The headline read, The Diner That Kindness Saved. Pictures of Ruth's diner appeared online and in newspapers. People from nearby towns started visiting, and soon the diner was busier than it had been in years. Ruth even had to hire 2 new helpers to keep up with the rush. But no matter how busy it got, Ruth never forgot that quiet morning or the man who had walked through her door when it was raining. Sometimes, late at night when the lights were low and the last customer had gone, she would hear the faint echo of engines in the distance. Maybe it was her imagination, or maybe it was her way of knowing that somewhere out there, those bikers still remembered her too. She would smile, pour herself a small cup of coffee, and look at the wooden bird on the shelf. Life had a funny way of surprising her, and as long as her doors were open and her heart stayed kind, Ruth believed good things would always find their way back. Months passed, and the little diner on Route 47 was no longer quiet the way it used to be. The story about Ruth and the bikers had spread far beyond her small town. Travelers stopped by every day, curious to see the place where something unusual and good had happened. Some came for coffee, some for stories, but most came just to feel the warmth that seemed to live in the walls of that small diner. Ruth took it all in stride. She never let the attention change her. To her, the diner was still what it had always been, a place for people to rest, talk, and feel human again. But inside, she couldn't deny that things had changed. Her heart felt fuller these days. The laughter was louder, the nights were longer, and the world seemed a little softer. One quiet morning before the first customer arrived, she sat by the window with her cup of coffee. The rising sun painted the road golden. She looked at the shelf where the 2 silver pins and the little wooden bird sat. They were reminders of how life could surprise her when she least expected it. She touched the wooden bird gently and whispered, "Hope you're doing all right out there." As if answering her thought, the sound of a motorcycle echoed faintly down the road. She smiled, shaking her head. "Can't be," she muttered. But a moment later, a single bike pulled up out front. The rider took off his helmet, and she recognized that familiar, calm smile. He looked different this time, tired, maybe older, but there was something in his eyes that told her he had come for a reason. He walked in, nodding at her like they'd just spoken yesterday. "Morning," he said. "Morning," she replied. "Coffee?" "Always." He sat down in the same booth as before. There was quiet between them, but it wasn't uncomfortable. After a while, Ruth leaned against the counter. "You've been gone a long time," she said softly. He nodded. "Been on the road? Things have been busy." She studied him for a moment. "You look like a man carrying too many miles," he chuckled. Ain't that the truth? Then he grew serious. I didn't just stop for coffee this time. I needed to see you. Needed to tell you something. Ruth waited, her hands resting on the counter. He took a deep breath. You remember that day you helped me? When the cops came? How could I forget? He nodded slowly. I wasn't just running from trouble. I was running from myself. I'd been part of a group that wasn't heading anywhere good. The kind of path that only ends one way. That day when you stood up for me, something shifted. You didn't ask who I was or what I'd done, you just helped. No judgment. No questions. It made me realize I could start over. Ruth's eyes softened. And did you? He smiled faintly. Took a while, but yeah. I've been helping some younger riders, kids who were about to make the same mistakes I did. Trying to show them there's another road they can take. Ruth smiled, pride shining quietly in her eyes. That's good work. Real good work, he shrugged. Guess I just learned from the best. Before Ruth could reply, the doorbell jingled and a few customers walked in. She moved back behind the counter, pouring coffee and serving plates, but her mind stayed on his words. She kept glancing at him as he ate in silence, the same calm look on his face. When the morning rush ended, he stood up and placed a small box on the counter. For you, he said. From all of us, Ruth frowned. You didn't have to bring me anything, he smiled. I know, but we wanted to. She opened the box carefully. Inside was a necklace with a small charm shaped like angel wings, silver and simple, just like the pins. It's beautiful, she whispered. He nodded. That's our way of saying you're one of us now. Family in a way. Ruth looked at him speechless. She'd never been part of something like that before. Her diner had always been her world, but this felt different. It felt bigger. Thank you, she said finally. I'll keep it close, he smiled warmly. That's all we ask. Later that afternoon, after he left, Ruth stood outside the diner and watched the road again. She could still hear the sound of his motorcycle fading into the distance. Something in her chest felt heavy, but in a good way, like the kind of feeling that stays when you've done something right. As days turned into weeks, Ruth kept busy. The diner continued to draw crowds, and she was thankful for the noise and life that filled her days. But one morning, she received a letter in the mail. There was no return address, only a small red-winged symbol stamped on the back. Her hands trembled slightly as she opened it. Inside was a simple handwritten note. We lost one of our own. He rode his last mile with peace in his heart. Said you showed him the road home. Thank you for giving him back to the world. Ruth sat down slowly, the letter shaking in her hand. Tears filled her eyes, blurring the words. She didn't need to ask who it was, she knew. The man she'd helped, the one who'd brought light back into her little diner, was gone. For a long time, she just sat there, the sound of the ticking clock filling the silence. Then with a trembling hand, she took the necklace he'd given her and fastened it around her neck. She whispered, You found your road, didn't you? That evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills, Ruth decided to do something she'd never done before. She turned off the lights, locked the diner early, and drove down Route 47. The road stretched endlessly ahead, the same one he had once ridden. She rolled down the window and let the cool wind brush her face. It felt like freedom. After a few miles, she pulled over near a hill that overlooked the valley. She could see the whole road from there, winding through the trees. She stood quietly, listening to the distant sounds of the world, the chirping crickets, the rustle of the wind, and somewhere faintly, the echo of an engine she swore she could still hear. She reached into her pocket and took out one of the silver pins. Holding it tightly, she whispered, Thank you for reminding me that kindness still matters. Then she placed the pin on the wooden post by the road, a small token for whoever might pass by. When she returned to the diner that night, the stars had already filled the sky. She sat by the window looking at the empty road and smiled. The world felt quieter but not lonely. She knew he was gone, but in some way he was still there. Every time the bell over the door rang, every time a tired traveler walked in needing warmth, every time she poured a cup of coffee for a stranger. The next morning, Ruth arrived early again. The sun rose bright and warm, and the diner glowed in the light. She looked at the necklace around her neck and the small wooden bird on the shelf. Then she whispered softly, For as long as this place stands, your story lives here. She opened the door, flipped the sign to open, and the bell chimed just as it always had. But this time it sounded sweeter. It sounded like the start of another story waiting to begin. The morning after she left the silver pin by the roadside, Ruth felt lighter. It was as if the air itself had shifted around her, wrapping her in something calm and steady. She didn't talk about what happened to anyone. The letter she'd received stayed tucked under the counter, next to her old recipe book. Whenever her heart felt heavy, she'd look at the necklace around her neck and feel that same quiet strength. Days passed and life returned to its usual rhythm at the diner. Truckers stopped in for their morning coffee, families on road trips came for her famous pies, and a few regulars took their usual seats without saying much. They all noticed something different in Ruth, though. She smiled softer, listened longer, and treated every customer like an old friend. People didn't know her story, but they could feel something special in her presence. One cloudy afternoon, a rumble filled the air, the familiar deep sound of motorcycles. Ruth looked up, a small smile forming as the sound grew louder. But this time it wasn't one or two bikes. It was dozens. The roar echoed down Route 47 like thunder rolling through the hills. The windows of the diner trembled, and the few customers inside turned to look. The first bike stopped right in front of the diner, followed by another and another. Within minutes, the parking lot was full. There must have been at least 50 riders, their jackets marked with the same symbol, the red-winged emblem she remembered. Ruth's heart began to race. She walked to the window, her hands trembling just a little. When she stepped outside, the wind carried the low hum of engines idling. The riders stood in a line, some taking off their helmets, some bowing their heads. The leader, a tall woman with braided hair, stepped forward, holding something wrapped in a black cloth. "Ma'am," she said respectfully, "we're here for him." Ruth didn't have to ask who she meant. Her chest tightened. The leader opened the cloth, revealing a small silver box with engraved wings. Ruth covered her mouth. "You came all this way," she whispered. The woman nodded. "He asked us to. Before his last ride, he made us promise to bring him back here where he found peace." Tears filled Ruth's eyes. She led them to the side of the diner, near the little patch of earth where wildflowers grew. Together they made a small circle. No one said much. The silence spoke for them. The leader placed the box down gently, then pulled out a folded piece of paper and read softly. He said this diner changed his life. Said kindness saved him when nothing else could. Ruth couldn't hold back anymore. The tears ran freely down her cheeks. The woman looked up at her and said, "He called you his angel." The group bowed their heads again. The sound of the wind carried through the trees, and somewhere, a lone bird cried out. Ruth knelt down and touched the ground near the box. "Thank you for coming back," she whispered. When they finished, the riders quietly walked back to their bikes. But before leaving, the leader turned to Ruth. "He left something else for you." She handed her a worn leather notebook. The cover was cracked, the pages yellowed. Ruth held it carefully, her hands shaking. After the last bike disappeared down the road, Ruth went back inside. She locked the door, made herself a cup of coffee, and sat down at her favorite table. She opened the notebook. Inside were stories, handwritten notes about people he'd met, things he'd learned, places he'd gone. And in the middle of it all, one line stood out in bold letters. "The road gave me freedom, but she gave me a reason to stop." Ruth pressed the book to her heart and let out a quiet sob. Then she smiled through her tears. "You old fool," she whispered, laughing softly. "You never did know how to say goodbye." Over the next few days, Ruth decided to do something new. She cleared one wall of the diner and began hanging photos. Travelers had taken many pictures there over the years, and she started putting them up. Each face, each moment, each memory. At the center, she placed a picture of the group from that first day when the bikers filled her lot. Beneath it, she hung the necklace charm that had broken off one morning. The wall became known as the Road of Kindness. Soon, customers started bringing their own pictures too. Truck drivers left snapshots from highways across the country. Soldiers sent postcards from overseas. Families mailed in photos of their road trips. Each one was taped carefully to the wall until it became a colorful patchwork of lives touched by the same message. Kindness still matters. Months turned into a year. The diner was busier than ever, but Ruth didn't mind. She loved watching strangers come together over coffee and stories. One day, a local reporter stopped by. "You've become a bit of a legend," he said with a smile. "They say bikers ride from other states just to stop here." Ruth chuckled. "I'm just serving coffee. They're the ones carrying the stories." The reporter looked at the wall and nodded. Still, that's quite a story to build from one act of kindness. She thought for a moment, then said softly, "Sometimes one small thing can echo farther than you expect." That night, when everyone left, Ruth sat by the window again. The road outside was quiet, lit by the moon. She opened the old notebook one more time, flipping through the pages. Near the back, she found something she hadn't noticed before, a folded letter tucked inside. She opened it carefully. The handwriting was his. "If you're reading this, it means my road's ended. But I don't want you to be sad. You gave me something no one else did. You saw the good in me. Promise me one thing. Keep the diner open for the lost ones. There'll always be someone needing a place to stop." Ruth pressed her hand to her heart and whispered, "I promise." The next morning, she placed that letter inside a small frame and hung it on the wall next to the photos. The words caught the sunlight through the window, glowing faintly. From that day forward, the diner had a new rule. No one left without a full heart and a full cup. As time passed, the writers still came. Not as many as before, but enough to keep the spirit alive. Some came just to sit in silence by the window. Others brought flowers or coins to leave by the wildflower patch outside. Every time Ruth saw them, she felt that same familiar warmth. One late evening, as she was closing, she noticed a young man standing by the door. He looked lost, eyes heavy, jacket torn. "Sorry, we're closing soon," she said gently. He nodded. "I know. I just needed a place to stop for a while." Ruth smiled softly. "Then you came to the right place." She poured him a cup of coffee the way she always did. As he sat down, his gaze fell on the wall of photos. "Who are all these people?" he asked quietly. Ruth looked at the pictures and said, "They're travelers, people who found a little hope here when they needed it." The young man nodded slowly. "I guess I need some of that too," Ruth smiled. "Then let's start with a hot meal." That night, when he left, she stood by the window and watched him walk down the road, disappearing into the dark. She felt the same feeling she'd had that first day, the sense that every stranger carried a story worth hearing. The diner lights flickered softly as she turned them off. The necklace glinted in the dim light, and the sound of the wind outside carried faintly through the cracks in the door. Somewhere she thought she heard the distant hum of motorcycles again. And Ruth, the woman who once stood alone behind a quiet counter, whispered into the night, "The road never really ends. It just keeps bringing people home."